And we're back. And we're now in, well, we're still in Book 6. We're still in the Nicomachean Ethics, but we're now on Chapter 5. So, again, there's a lot of terminology in Book 6 because Aristotle's trying to differentiate a whole pile of notions. But always keep in mind, the key thing that he's after is to develop and complete his understanding and investigation of the notion of arte, of virtue. And what we've got primarily running in Chapter 6, and just to keep your focus because it's easy to get lost in all this, is truth is involved, reason is involved, that is with ethics, but it's a specific kind of truth. It's about things that can be other than they are, variable things, as Aristotle would say, and the kind of reasoning that is important to ethics, because if you remember way back in the earlier books, when Aristotle was talking about the character virtues, he said that, well, you not only have to control your emotions, which is the whole idea of a character virtue, is getting your emotions under control, and having not control simply as in a stifling or suppressing. Aristotle is not saying that, but controlling them in the proper way, to exhibit the right kind of emotion at the right time. So it's all appropriate. To hit that mean, because the mean is not something mathematical. You can't just have a simple formula. You have to do some kinds of thinking in it. And in that sense, you need reason to come in, not just merely to control your emotions, but to tell them what the appropriate kind of control is for you in that situation. So it's a fairly complex notion that's not captured in a simple phrase or whatnot. But the whole idea in Book 6 is to develop and put the capstone, if you like, or the keystone into this great notion of virtue, to be a virtuous person, to put it all together. So what he's really after is, in Book 6, is what's the kind of reasoning that we need in order to complete the character virtues. Because remember, reason has to be in control for Aristotle. Emotions are important, but they shouldn't run the show, because that's not going to lead you to eudaimonia. So ultimately, what's leading to eudaimonia is having the, quote, right reason. That's going to turn out to be phronesis, to help us with our emotions and get everything in order. So far, we've talked about grasping the eternal truths, and ultimately the initial grasping of the basics, all these truths, is through nous, and nous functioning in a variety of ways. Episteme is demonstrating, moving around these eternal truths. We've also got particular thing of transient truths, what we looked at. That's techne, that's when we're making stuff, making bread. Sometimes this techne is translated as art or craft or skill. And remember, when you're making things, there's a chance element involved as well. But most importantly, when you make the object is external to the process. Loaf of bread outside the baking process. There is an agent involved here in techne. There's always an agent involved. In the sense of episteme, you can think of the agent as this very passive observer and working around the eternal truths that are kind of there. With the notion of the agent, when it comes to things like techne and phronesis, the agent's more involved. The agent's kind of shaping and introducing variation into the world. So the truths will be about objects that can vary, so the truths as well are not eternal truths. When you're talking about techne, the object that emerges is, yes, it's variable, external to the process. When you're now digging in to the person as agent in the specific way of phronesis, the object brought forth is not an external object, it's an action, a praxis. Remember that term? We talked about that earlier a little bit. That's this mixture again, another mixture of desire and rationality that's involved. And now the action is internal to the process. It's not like you're trying to make something. It's the actual doing of it is the point, right? The whole point of phronesis is not to produce an object, right? That's a techne, right? The whole point of phronesis is to behave well. So the point of it is not external to the process. So the building up of it, right, the habituation and all the things that you do are part of the process, but that's also the living well itself. So it's not like some finished product. Phronesis, is not like techne, where sort of the activity comes to an end and then you have a product, like a static product, like a loaf of bread. So you have to get around that kind of thinking and thinking of phronesis as an activity, and the behavior, the actions are part of the activity. So it's more of a piece. So phronesis then is the grasping of truths that are linked to praxis, and we're talking about human actions. All right, so let's look a little bit more now at phronesis. And if you really, this is sometimes translated as practical wisdom, if you like. Again, as you know, I'm not big on translating everything. Sometimes I think it's better off you get a little bit more of an insight if you try and hang on the certain Greek words and flesh them out accordingly, rather than relying on a translation which brings all its baggage in terms of its English connotations. All right, so phronesis. Now, remember that episteme dealt with demonstrating, right? So that's nice, neat, tidy logic, right? That's where you have those little arguments that I put in boxes in a previous video, and you're demonstrating. Phronesis, remember, is about deliberation. It's got deliberation, and deliberation basically is this notion of putting desires and reason together, right? Recall Aristotle's earlier discussion of choice. And remember, you don't deliberate about things that are outside your power or abilities, right? Things that cannot be otherwise. So deliberation is always about that which is varying, or varying objects. And in this case, its deliberation is is dealing with praxis, right? It's dealing with our actions. All right, so what are we talking about here now when it comes to, shall we say, praxis and actions and phronesis? Well, as I said, it's a practical wisdom about objects that could be otherwise. Actions are not going to be like, just any kinds of motions that we do, because, again, with techne, there's all kinds of motions there, and that's not, grasping a cup of tea is not a praxis and necessarily involving phronesis. All right, so we can rule out all these kinds of things. Aristotle now comes to a way of trying to figure something out by looking at what people do. And we've seen Aristotle do this in earlier books when he was canvassing, starting to look at what the idea of, what's basically the great good for us or whatever. And he looked at what a variety of people said, and what everybody from the best of the society, according to Aristotle, to the common person and all that stuff. We've seen Aristotle, shall we say, kind of play the sociologist or do a little survey of what people think. And he says, look, if we want to figure out what phronesis is really about, why don't we just look at people that we think have it? So, in other words, again, if you're really worried about, okay, what is this practical wisdom? Let's look at the people whom we think have practical reason. Okay, now, you could quibble with this. You could say something like this. Okay, I don't know what phronesis is. I don't know what you're talking about, or this practical wisdom. What are you talking about? If that's the case, and if I don't really know what phronesis is, how would I know, with any real sense of certainty, whether or not a person I'm talking to has phronesis, has this practical wisdom? Because I don't know what it is, right? I'm trying to figure out what it is, and you're telling me, go talk to people who have it, and I could respond by saying, well, who has it? I don't know how to make that judgment as to who has it or who doesn't. Some people might have shall we say, a fake or a bogus notion of practical wisdom. I wouldn't know. I don't know how it works. So this, if you've read some Plato, this has the feel of the Meno problem, right? If you're looking for something, you have to have an idea of what it is, because you wouldn't know if it, jumped right out at you. If it's something that you don't understand at all, then an example could be right in your face, and you wouldn't know. You might totally overlook it or whatnot. So Aristotle doesn't go into this Meno problem. I think what we can take from his discussion is something like this. We may not know. And you can read this into much of the Nicomachean Ethics, I would argue. We may not know the nice, tidy definitions of lots of these terms, but we use them, and we seem to get along. We seem to, relate to each other. We seem to understand each other. So when Aristotle says, if you want to know what phronesis is, go talk to people who possess this characteristic, it's that we have some kind of, shall we say, implicit understanding, some kind of idea as to what the person of phronesis, the person of practical wisdom, looks like and behaves like. So we're not totally lost. We do come to much of this with some idea. And that more or less dovetails with what Aristotle did say way at the beginning in Book 1, where he says, I can't teach you ethics really completely I can't teach it if you haven't been raised right by your parents in any way. Now, he doesn't really tell us exactly what raised right means, but it is in the sense that, you have some kind of understanding of a variety of these things. And I think what Aristotle is saying, well, if you've been probably raised right, you'll have some sense of respect for your elders, and some sense of respect for your elders would be, well, your elders have some kind of wisdom that you don't, and that you want to acquire, or some kind of ability to reason about practical things that you as a young person don't have yet, but at least you recognize basically what it looks like, and you can learn from people that have it. So you're at the stage of having a very implicit understanding, but not in the sense where it would be explicit, where you could unpack it if someone says, oh, well, you say your grandpa has phronesis. What exactly does that mean? You'd be in the position at this stage of saying, well, I'm not really sure. He just seems to be good at this kind of reasoning about practical things, but I'm not sure really what to say anything about it, or how to talk about it in detail. All right, so here we go. So we've got maybe, since, as I've said, this kind of implicit sort of understanding. We can recognize people that have phronesis. So we ask them, what is it all about? This is Aristotle, shall we say, doing an empirical study. So a person with phronesis would impress us as having a number of a variety of skills. A person with phronesis would impress us, having this practical reason, would be somebody who we could say is resourceful, right? Always can sort of figure out how to do a variety of things. But we don't want to say just clever, right? Clever at fixing things or whatever. No, wisdom usually implies something that's broader than just the notion of being clever about things. All right, so there's a number of so we say that we can think of phronesis as having a number of parts, and in Aristotle, if you read this chapter 5, he kind of goes pretty slowly. He's plodding away. So you have to be patient. Well, you always have to be patient when you're reading Aristotle. But he's assembling, in a way you can think of Aristotle as assembling a profile of someone who has phronesis. And well, you might recognize it or you might not. But Aristotle has a number of observations in this chapter of what a person with phronesis would look like. So what does that mean? Well, it's thought characteristic. It is thought to be characteristic of a person who has this practical wisdom, a wise person, one of phronesis, who can deliberate well about things, Aristotle says, that are advantageous to himself. Or herself, it doesn't really matter, and not necessarily in specific contexts. So, not necessarily. So, the deliberation is about general beneficial aspects of life, not just simply particulars. So, in that sense, what sorts of things are conducive to the good life in general? So, general beneficial aspects of life, right? And it's what leads to the good life in a very general notion. So, not just about health, not just about money matters or whatnot, about larger scale things. So the person with phronesis can deliberate well, not just about sort of these narrow things, like what's good for health, because, think about it. Somebody could be a good nutritionist and really be good at planning out meals and buying groceries and making sure you get all good stuff and all that healthy things for the body, but not be very good about the way, let's say, he plans his money. And the next person could be, she's really good with money, but not very good with planning meals and stuff like that, isn't a good nutritionist. So we can, or somebody, maybe she's good at a couple of things and there's something else, I don't know, that is not good of. But the point is that something else that maybe she's not good at, but being good at nutrition and planning, that's something else that this person's not good at, might be an important thing that's conducive to the good life. So we're talking about being able to reason. No, and another thing that we have to be careful about is it's not just a laundry list. Like phronesis is not just saying, well, you got it. There's all these things you have to be good at. So somebody with phronesis is good at planning out, their diet and what's good for the body, et cetera, their financial matters. Maybe looking after their house, looking after relationships with spouses, friends, kids, whatever, parents, or whatnot. It shouldn't be thought of as a collection or a laundry list of things you're good at, right? Because you could ultimately be good, right? And you think about the notion of the fallacy of composition. You could be good about a bunch of things, but that doesn't mean you're going to be good about the whole. You could be good at planning all little things, but you're not good at arranging them all. The notion of phronesis really is you could be good at all kinds of individual things and not really have phronesis in Aristotle's sense of the term. Because, again, with phronesis, it's not just being good at individual things. It's about how to put them all into a general package, into a general good life. That's why the person who truly has phronesis is able to be the truly virtuous person, because that person knows, in a variety of situations, how to adjust the character virtues, right? So how to behave in certain contexts with regard to managing one's fear. And so, knowing in certain contexts that, it's good to be fearful, and so you would behave in a fearful way, like you don't jump out of airplanes without parachutes and things like that. And also when it's appropriate to get angry about something. Or even, as Aristotle does say in places, a good virtuous soldier would know when it's important to be, and necessary, in fact, to be violent. When people are attacking your city, you don't want your soldiers to say, well, I refuse to take up arms or whatever and defend the place. So this having this phronesis is being able to balance all kinds of things, and shall we say, it's being able to see the big picture, to have a good balance of the whole thing. And this notion of having the whole thing balanced, that's the big action that's coming out of this, not, sort of these individual things. And in that sense, right, so the actions are all about the process of balancing. It's not like another thing comes out. It's not like there's, goods, and then a good life is something external to the goods. The goods are all part of it. The balancing is all part of it. And that whole balancing and getting a whole sort of harmonious whole in terms of your soul both of its emotions and its rationality. That's really what phronesis is aiming at, and that's where you get the notion of a virtuous person. But again, as Aristotle says, that's a matter of deliberation. You got to get good at that. You can get better at it, but it's always things that are varying. So you're not going to say that someone who has phronesis is going to give you these logical arguments. And because it doesn't have this logical type structure, it's not something that you're going to have when you're really young. That's why you find you can have really good chess players, very young age. You can have wickedly good mathematicians, very young age. But marriage counselor, 5 years old, 6 years old? No, you can have grandmasters at chess when, like children that are excellent. But they're not going to be able to have that kind of practical wisdom, or, as Aristotle would say, the notion of phronesis. All right, so that'll do it for this video. But the whole thing here with phronesis is being able to see the big picture and make everything fit in order to construct a good life. All right, see you next video.